Maroon Spirit 954. We are in week 6 of the last fiscal quarter of the year 2019, the 400th year milestone, 1619 to 2019, 400 years of legal slavery, Jim Crow, convict leasing, mass incarceration, chemical warfare, aka the crack era, and now the gay agenda. Tonight's Carter G. Woodson quote from The Miseducation of the Negro. Leadership is usually superimposed for the purpose of directing the course of the ostracized group along sane lines. This was accomplished during the days of slavery by restricting the assembly of Negroes to certain times and places and compelling them to meet in the presence of a stipulated number of the wisest and discreetest men of the community. These supervisors of the conduct of Negroes would prevent them from learning the truth, which might make them unruly or ambitious to become free. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. Tonight's black inventor, Mr. James Wormley, invented the life-saving apparatus for ships. Federal patent number 242091, May 24th, 1881. Definitions. School. Any institution at which instruction is given in a particular discipline. Education. An enlightening experience. American. Noun. A native or citizen of the United States. Descendants. One who follows in the bloodline of an ancestor, either lineally or collaterally. Slavery. A situation in which one person has absolute power over the life, fortune, and liberty of another. Treaty. An agreement formally signed, ratified, or adhered to between two nations or sovereigns. Reparations. The act of making amends for a wrong. The 12 steps for the American descendants of slavery. Step 1. Learn about the estate or estates your family originated from. Step 2. Who established that estate? Step 3. What nation and confederacy had jurisdiction over that area prior to the European? Step 4. Ask all nonprofit organizations you attend, what's your position on reparations? Step 5. They either support it or they don't. No support, no money. However, if they support it, then immediately children and adults need weekly classes free of charge about steps 1, 2, and 3, and field trips to ADOS landmarks in that city, county, and state. Step 6. Don't support European holidays for the remainder of the year. Step 7. Avoid spending money with any small business that doesn't hire your people. Step 8. All businesses need operating cash. Spend money with American black businesses. Step 9. All other groups rely on our energy and operating cash to survive. Set the trends of making other groups follow our lead and support our clubs, services, products, and entertainment. Step 10. The United States government is bankrupt The Federal Reserve prints money, i.e. quantitative easing. It also burns money, i.e. quantitative tightening. The U.S. dollar hasn't been backed by gold since Richard Nixon in 1971. The government operates off the full faith of its citizens to pay debt and taxes. American descendants of slavery no longer have faith in the United States government. This is why financial support will be altered, stopped, and redirected. Step 11. Teach your kids 1 hour a day about their history on this land. Subsection A. Have them learn about a black inventor. Subsection B. Have them know about our heroes. Subsection C. They should know the European that conquered the estate you live in. Subsection D. They should know the nation of people prior to European invasion, militarily and culturally. Step 12. Practicing these steps will educate us on the land we're claiming, America, and attaches us to the history and laws of the United States government. Every estate American descendants of slavery live in should have steps 1, 2, and 3 advertised via social media, radio, and newspaper. This in 13 weeks, one fiscal quarter, will bring us together for our common cause. So here we are. We're in week 6, and the month of October is officially in the books. And we'll get into a little bit more of that at the end of this educational experience. We had our first major holiday pass, and you have to ask yourself a question now that the month of October is in the books and all accounting has been closed or stopped. Where did you spend your money? Who did you spend your money with? That nonprofit organization that you attend, did you ask the question? What's your stance on reparations? Did you attend that nonprofit organization's business meeting? Did you talk to the leader of that organization, the secretary or the treasurer, and ask the question? Did you spend money with any of these small businesses that don't hire our people? See, the beauty of inventory and the beauty of doing a financial accounting of yourself, you're never going to be perfect. You strive for progress, not perfection. But the concept and the practical program of action is get in the habit of looking at where you're spending your money and what you're spending your money on, and redirect your spending habits. We've been doing this for over 21 days, so by now you should have healthy habits when it comes to where you spend your money, if you've been working on it. So let's get into the Maroon historical points. Point 1. Maroon's prosperity made them an object of envy and then attacked by Europeans. Point 2. Maroons most likely to face military assault were situated on lands Europeans wanted. Point 3. Maroons also faced assault because they were in business whites sought to control. Point 4. Maroon leaders were first and foremost military figures. Point 5. The young represented the future, and the elder represented gallant traditions and valuable traditions. Point 5. I want to read that one again. The young represented the future, and the elder represented gallant traditions and valuable traditions. So here we are in 2019, and the first half of point 5 is true and correct. The young do represent the future. But let's take a look for a second at the elder represent gallant traditions and valuable traditions. What traditions have been passed down from our elders to Generation X that we've now in turn passed down to our kids, which are the millennials and pretty much a gay population. What did we pass down? Let's look at it for a second. And I'm going to keep it real with Generation X because whether you're highly schooled and miseducated or you were a high school dropout and miseducated, or you could be a dropout and be educated, or you could be highly schooled and educated. There's some things that we all can agree on when it comes to Generation X. Let's jump back to the 90s. What became our culture? I can remember vividly older people in my family when they were first hearing rap music, when it really took off in the 90s. They all agreed on one thing. How do you listen to that filth? You know what? They were right. You fast forward 20 years and that filth, which is what they called it, has become the most dominant music in society. But let's jump back to the 90s real quick. So we had gangster rap coupled with chemical warfare, which is that's the term I use when I refer to the crack era. That was chemical warfare. And I got to add in 2 Live Crew. So you mix 2 Live Crew, gangster rap, and the crack era. And what happened? What happened to that first generation of integration? Those kids born in the 70s that didn't know racism, that went to school with everybody. What happened to that generation by the time the 90s came around and they were in high school? Crime exploded. Prison population exploded. Think about all the kids that were born doing Freaknik, Daytona Spring Break, and all the skipping school parties. A lot of those fathers are doing life. A lot of those women are doing life. Think about how we were growing up and you didn't have to live in a quote unquote project to see the devastation of chemical warfare or the crack era. But I think all of us can relate to a middle-aged adult, late 20s, early 30s, maybe even in their 40s, working at the post office or some good job. And they got on crack. And 2 weeks later, you couldn't even recognize them. 100 pounds lighter, job gone. And being kids, it wasn't funny, but it was funny because you're like, man, he fell off quick. But we didn't see the devastation behind that. Yeah, that's a loss of income. That's a house. That's a car repossessed. That's a house being foreclosed on. Or what about that young lady in the prime of her life that got on crack cocaine? And all the neighborhood teenagers ended up running through her. She started selling her body. What I'm saying is the tradition that we have today, it's a dying culture. We are living in a dying culture. All of us can remember from Generation X in the 90s, the older generation turned their back on us. They would say things like, y'all done lost your mind. And granted, a lot of us did lose their mind. Those of us that got hooked on that chemical warfare called crack, a lot of us were losing their mind, but the older generation turned their back on us. They were just afraid of us as Europeans. So that allowed the Europeans to pass laws like the 94 crime bill. Since you're scared of your own kids, we got a place for them. And it's funny, growing up in that time, now I have parents and adults from my generation who now look at our kids. If you're 25 and younger, these are our kids, Generation X. Now you're looking at your kids and you're trying to do the same thing that the older generation was doing to us in the 90s. You're trying to say that they're wilder than we were. So once again, we're perpetuating the second generation of no tradition and no culture. Because when you turn your back on that next generation and just say they shot out, there's nothing we can do with them, you know, they off the chain. Well, what that allows is the Europeans who run cities, counties, states, and the federal government, because human beings run government, human beings run cities, human beings run states, and human beings run counties. So when you turn your back on your people, now we have a school to prison pipeline on our watch as adults. We have to take credit for that. Just like the older generation, our parents have to take credit for the 94 crime bill, because they were in the prime of their life when Joe Biden wrote that law. So here we are in the prime of our life, and these kids, the millennials, which are our kids, I think we've done more damage than our elders. The mass incarceration kicked off with our elders when we were teenagers and going into our early 20s. Now on our watch, as middle-aged adults, we've allowed our kids to experience school to prison pipeline. So in a 20-year period, we went from mass incarceration in the mid-90s of young adults. At least they were waiting until you were 18 before they were slamming your back out, giving you crazy football numbers. Now we've allowed our kids to get targeted in elementary school. Now they're going off 3rd and 4th grade tests. That's on our watch. And they're also pushing gay history. That's on our watch. So I wanted to emphasize that point, because the young represent the future and the elder represented the gallant traditions and valuable traditions. What traditions are we passing, or have we passed on to the millennials? What have we passed on to them? Rap culture, sexualized music, and prostitution. That's become our culture. And it started with us in the 90s. Something to think about when you look at a group of people that's in last place as a group under the United States government. When you sit back and you just take time to think for 30 minutes and just say, why do no politicians speak about us? Why do they talk around us and use terms like people of color, minority, rainbow coalition? Why do they never address us and call us by what we want to be called by? How is it that illegal immigrants are fighting for rights, but they're illegal on our watch? How is all this happening? How are European women who live in the same household as European men and European kids, how have they carved themselves out and made an entity? You're still within the European household, but you've carved out a Me Too movement to even get more privilege. And then you have a gay community who's carved out their niche to get more privilege. And you've got not Europeans, you have immigrants, illegal and legal, who have carved out a niche to get more privileges. And the one group of people who have not moved with any privilege is us. How is that? How are we standing still in the 400th year milestone under this government? All we have to do is look at our traditions. Notice what I said the traditions are. We're no longer in the crack era. We're still in chemical warfare, but now the doctor has become the dope man. So it went from the young black man in the 90s being the drug dealer. Now the doctor is the drug dealer through prescribed medication. We're still in chemical warfare. However, because it's targeting Europeans and their kids, they're going to get recovery programs, not incarceration. So we have a drug culture. We have a prostitute culture. We've had that amongst our women since the 90s. It kicked off in the 90s with the music that we were listening to. Let's just be real. It kicked off in the 90s. Now it's exploded via Instagram and all these different social media devices. And now you have the boys that are also practicing prostitution culture through gay sexual activity. Our kids. These are our kids. I never hear people talk about that. We don't own that. These are our kids. And the one thing that you have not heard me mention is our historical awareness, our political awareness, and our legal awareness. That's why we're in last place. We'll dance to the music. We'll use drugs. 7 out of 10 women are raising our kids on their own. This is where we are, and this is how we've become in last place. We're in serious trouble. So let's get into a quick recap about the Trail of Tears. Point 1 on the recap of the Trail of Tears. Europeans, now known as U.S. citizens in 1830, instituted an Indian Removal Act. So Andrew Jackson institutes the Indian Removal Act. Now, keep in mind, there is no such thing as an Indian in North America. That is a term that the European created, no different than the term people of color, no different than the term minority, no different than the term inner city, rainbow coalition. The term Indian does not apply to Native Americans. Native Americans will tell you they are not Indians. They have nations, and their nations have a name. However, Andrew Jackson instituted a law called the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The second point, this act was a mass deportation of the 5 nations. Over 60,000 Native American and Maroons were sent to Arkansas and Oklahoma. The next point, cultures were uprooted by Army troops and people were driven to alien climates and locations. Point 4, homes were burned, livestock, tools, personal possessions seized and destroyed. Point 5, under federal bayonets, they went westward in midwinter. Point 6, Native Americans became more dependent upon European goods and values. Next point, 1830 to 1860, a 30-year time span, population declined sharply amongst Native Americans and Maroons. In that same time period, from 1830 to 1860, European population increased. 1860, Cherokees held 2,511 slaves. Choctaws had 2,344 slaves. The Creek Nation had 1,532 slaves, and Chickasaws had 975 slaves. So we can see now clearly, looking at the history of the Maroon Nation and looking at the history of the Seminole Nation, which their main stronghold was in Florida. We can see now that as they were forced militarily to go westward of the Mississippi River, we can now see that we had a lot of black Seminoles and American descendants of slavery, which were also black. So we got black people from two different nations going west of the Mississippi with three other nations as well. But we got a lot of black people going west of the Mississippi. Now, pull up a map on your phone when you get a chance of North America, so you can get an understanding of where Florida is, where Alabama's located, where Mississippi is located, where Arkansas is located, and where Oklahoma is located. You had to go through Alabama and Mississippi in order to get to Arkansas and Oklahoma. So we can clearly see that the blacks that were in Oklahoma and Arkansas were descendants of the American descendants of slavery from Florida. We were never taught that in school, but now we know that. That's a historical fact. The Trail of Tears links directly to how huge number of black Seminoles and other blacks that were a part of Native American nations, as well as American descendants of slavery, we have connected the link of how we went from the southeast region, that Florida, Georgia area, and we migrated through Alabama, through Mississippi, crossed the Mississippi River, and got into Arkansas and Oklahoma. Why am I breaking it down in that manner? If a lot of people from the Maroon Nation and the Seminole Nation went west of the Mississippi and ended up in Oklahoma, those people that ended up in Oklahoma were descendants of the Maroon Nation and the Seminole Nation. So if you go back to that point about the elders passing on traditions, those people from the Maroon Nation and the Seminole Nation, don't you think they knew how to run a government? Don't you think they knew how to have a military? So does it surprise you that we had Tulsa in Oklahoma? Do you see the descendants, the bloodline? Do you see how that game was passed down within 2 generations? So this Trail of Tears, there were kids and adults. Those kids become adults in Oklahoma, have kids, right? They remember the Trail of Tears. They pass that information on to their kids. So 2 generations after the Trail of Tears, you get Tulsa, the Black Wall Street. But before there was a Tulsa, there was the Maroon Nation, where those American descendants of slavery not only had their own governors and kings, they also had Fort Negro and Fort Mose. And they were told stories about how their granddad or their grandma would bum rush slave plantations and go get, their elders, so that fighting spirit was passed down. Now you fast forward all the way to 1990 and you look at what we've passed down to the millennials. You look at what Generation X has passed down to the millennial generation and look at what the Maroon Nation and the Seminole Nation that were sent on the Trail of Tears to Arkansas and Oklahoma. Look at what they passed down to their descendants and look at what we're passing down to our descendants. Can you see the huge drop off and where we're headed as a group? Individually, some of us are going to make it. Those of us that are in the know. But as a group, can you already see where we're headed? We're in bad shape. So let's pick up after the Trail of Tears. We're west of the Mississippi now. Let's pick up and let's see what happens now that we're west of the Mississippi. 1846, Wildcat went to Texas 3 times to meet the Kickapoos, the Lipans, the Apaches, and the Tonkawas. All right, so once we get situated out west, the first thing Wildcat's trying to do is he's trying to organize. He's in new land. He's trying to set up relationships with the Kickapoos, the Lipans, the Apaches, and the Tonkawas. Wildcat wanted to form a union and recruit from the 5 nations in Texas and Arkansas. So he was trying to build relationships. None of these nations chose to help Seminoles and Maroons fight Creek, Europeans, or slave hunters. So basically, the Seminoles and the Maroons were new on the scene. We're the darker skinned people. Nobody wanted to do business with us. In 1849, the United States Attorney General ruled that black Seminoles were still slaves under the United States government law. Now that's huge. So the Maroons that took the trip, which it was over 500 of them that took the trip west with the Seminole Nation, because remember now, a lot of Maroons are still in Florida and Seminoles are still in Florida. A lot of them didn't leave. So remember, the Third Seminole War never stopped. So it's still war going on in Florida. We're moving west of the Mississippi. Understand that. So after 3 treaties, the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, the Treaty of Fort Gibson, and the Treaty of Fort Gordon, the United States government still turns around after signing 2 treaties agreeing to send the Seminole Nation to Arkansas and Oklahoma. The United States government then turns around and says, nah, we're going to deem you as slaves. So you're just like those Maroons and those runaways, American descendants of slavery. 1849. Also in 1849, a pro-slavery faction defeated Wildcat's bid to lead the nation. So once that went into law that the Seminole Nation was deemed to be slaves, now you got a group of Native Americans that's like, okay, if we can legally work them for free, okay, I'm for that. So Wildcat was unable to lead the nation because there were other people in the nation that were like, okay, I'm cool with this, right? At the same time, Chief John Horse founded the town of Weewaka in 1849. When you get a chance, look that up. Chief John Horse founded the town of Weewaka in 1849. Also in 1849, Wildcat moved toward Mexico. All right, so you've been betrayed at this point. Seminole Nation signed 2 treaties to go to Arkansas and Oklahoma. 1849, the United States Attorney General deems the black Seminoles to be slaves. Wildcat was trying to negotiate with the different nations west of the Mississippi River to see if they could come together. He was probably trying to school them like, look, we got a problem with these Europeans. Don't do business with them. Nobody wanted to do business with them. They were alienated. They were looked at as the black sheep. Wildcat was unable to lead the nation. So here's where the politics come in within the Seminole Nation and within the Maroon Nation. The Maroon Nation, we already knew. We're used to this. We've already escaped the legal construct of slavery. So now the Seminole Nation has been deemed slaves. So Wildcat gets his followers, and now they're moving toward Mexico. So in order to get to Mexico, you got to go through Texas. All right. So 1849, Wildcat moved toward Mexico, Rio Grande, after Creeks and Europeans demanded Maroons and black Seminoles surrender their sons. That goes right back to the school system. And that goes right back to the beginning of slavery. The first enslaved were the first to escape. By 1849, the European had been on this land over 200 years, conquering different nations militarily and enslaving dark-skinned people under their legal construct of slavery. So they had experience in doing this. They got 200 years of experience by this point in 1849. So they knew we can't break the spirit of the older or middle-aged Seminole or Maroon. Give us your kids and we'll school them into being good little Negroes. Look at this concept, because this concept applies today. 1849, Wildcat moved toward Mexico, Rio Grande, after Creeks and Europeans demanded Maroons and black Seminoles surrender their sons. What do we do when we send our kids to school? You're surrendering your kids to the European school system. I got to go back to the Vietnam War, any of the world wars, the Gulf War, the Afghanistan War. Even in defeat, other nations of people do not let their enemy school their kids. But yet the American descendant of slavery brags on the schooling from the European. In today's society, you brag if you go to Harvard. You brag if you go to University of Texas or University of Tennessee. You brag that you've been schooled by your historical enemy. And the reason why I'm bringing that up, you can never have a revolution or a radical change of circumstances for a group. I'm not going to say never. I'm going to say it is extremely hard to have a radical change for a group of people, in particular the American descendants of slavery, when they're being miseducated. If they're not properly taught their history on this land and what happened to their ancestors, there's no burning fire to change it. And so here we are. 400 years later, we're more lost than our ancestors in the 1800s. 400 years later, we are more lost than our ancestors were in the 1800s. At least in the 1800s, our ancestors were losing land, but they knew their history and they knew who their enemy was. Now we're losing land, don't know who the enemy is, and we don't know our history. Next point. The summer of 1850 at the Mexican border, Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande at Eagle Pass. So at this point, the Seminoles have been legally deemed as slaves. So a year later, they're heading into Mexico. So we can clearly see, now we know we have a large group of black Seminoles and black Maroons that are now going into Mexico in 1850. September 1850, black Seminoles and Maroons that stayed behind were kidnapped by slave hunters. So we see the same concept or the same business model in the Midwest that we saw on the East Coast with the original 13 colonies and in Florida. What we see is Native Americans that were dark skinned being captured and put into slavery, along with dark skinned American descendants of slavery that were being put into the legal construct of slavery. So we clearly see a pattern here. Your skin is your sin. I was born into this by default. And I'm going to be honest with you, the more that I wake up and the more that I become conscious of our history and the more that my eyes are opening to the reality of being under military occupation, sometimes I feel embarrassed to be an American descendant of slavery. Because I look around at my group and it's like, we don't care. And we don't care because we don't know. This is a military occupation. Why is this not being told? Because if it were being told to us as kids in school, there would have been change on this land. That's just human nature. We are under military occupation. Europeans are not Americans. We are under military occupation. It gets worse. So 1850, Wildcat took 800 people into Mexico and brought Cherokee and Creek slaves to learn his route. So the good thing about this last note was at least the Seminoles and the Maroons were able to get some of the Creeks and enslave them, because the Creeks were notorious for enslaving us and being horrible to us, as well as the Cherokee. But we really have to get a clear understanding. We are under military occupation. North America is the land. The United States government is the European constructed government that was established after military victory. North America is the land. The United States government is the Europeans' construction after military victory. Once they got their foot on this land and established militarily, they were able to set up shop and start doing business. We have been miseducated through the school system to completely forget that realization. And so now we're looking at our military enemy as if they're American. And then things happen to us and we throw our hands up and say, why? Oh, where's justice? And we all, we divert back to the system. We know the system's crooked. Everybody says it. We're not going to get any justice, or we'll always use the word they, or what they do, or how they do. We always refer to Europeans in a third person point of view. Why don't we just be honest with it and just say, you know what? It's military occupation. We are prisoners of war without a treaty. We have a Civil Rights Act, two to be exact, 1866 and 1964. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, we got bunched in, as I've explained earlier, with a whole bunch of other fabricated groups of people. And we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which we'll get into that in a couple of weeks. We're gonna read the Constitution, and we're gonna read those amendments. Most American descendants of slavery have never read the Constitution, going back to the culture of Generation X, and you wonder why we're in last place. We are ripe for the killing right now. Not only have we always been prisoners of war, we are even more politically ignorant than we've ever been, because most people who hear this video, ask yourself a question. Have you ever read the United States Constitution? Have you ever read in particular the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment that your ancestors fought for? If you haven't, just understand, that's a nigga. You're a prisoner of war. You're under a government that militarily conquered this land, and you have no clue of that reality. That's a nigga. And that's right where the European wants you mentally, because that ensures safe occupation on the conquered land. Wow. So let's go back to step 6. Now that we're in week 6 of this 13-week fiscal experiment. And again, this is for the kids. If anybody from Generation X or an older generation can take anything from these historical facts and these military records, even if you're in denial and you're saying, nah, we're not under military occupation, he's talking crazy. Why am I citing majors and generals and attorney generals? I'm doing it for a reason. I'm showing you, I'm citing to military officers. We are under military occupation. We are prisoners of war. But step 6 of the 12-step program of recovery for the American descendant of slavery, because this is all mental. This is all mental. What we are dealing with, what we are going through, this is mental genocide. We don't even know that we're prisoners of war. So step 6 says, don't support European holidays for the remainder of the year. We've had 2 European holidays in the month of October. The first was Christopher Columbus Day. If you celebrated that holiday, you're a nigga. See, the line has to be drawn. And that old, sick Negro tradition that's got us in this state mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and financially, it has to be burned. So the next European holiday in October was Halloween. Did you go out and spend money to dress your kid up and run around and get them a large surplus of candy? If you did, on your ancestors' 400th year milestone, and you still, if you've heard one of these videos and you're armed with the information and you still chose to participate in one of 2 of those European holidays or both European holidays, just know you are a nigga. You a nigga. So we got a big one coming up. Thanksgiving. As we walk through our history as American descendants of slavery, and me starting with my own personal lineage, which my bloodline on both sides of my family go back to the estate of Georgia, which is why this is part of my bloodline story. The Seminole Nation, the Maroon Nation, this is part of my story. If your people come from the estate of Mississippi or the estate of Alabama, yours is going to have a little different spin to it. But for my personal lineage, this is my story. How can an American descendant of slavery celebrate Thanksgiving after listening to any of these videos? How can you do it? How can you do it? I'll go one further. Native Americans from any nation. Do you think they celebrate Thanksgiving? Do you think they celebrate the slaughter, the burning, and the pillaging of their ancestral land? Do you think they honor that they couldn't go back to their original homeland because it was burned? Who honors that? We honor it. We'll justify celebrating Thanksgiving. Me personally, I haven't celebrated Thanksgiving. I haven't celebrated any European holidays, if I'm being honest with you, pretty much my whole adult life. When I read Afro-Americans and European holidays and mental genocide, I was 2021. Changed my life. Changed my life. And I'm going to go even further. As an American descendant of slavery, if you want to get your finances in order, or I'm going to ask this question. If you don't have an emergency fund, why are you spending money on any holidays anyway? Because, see, we good to justify why we want to, stay addicted to European holidays. If you don't have 3 months of your personal living expenses in a savings account for emergencies, then why are you spending money? We can put it that way. Because if you look up emergency fund, all bankers will tell you a minimum of 3 months of living expenses. If you don't have 3 months of, I'm not talking about a credit card limit. I'm talking about Federal Reserve notes in a bank, liquid cash set aside. If you don't have that set aside, why are you out? Why are you spending money? You're poor. Poor is all money comes in the front door, goes out the back. Broke is temporary. If you don't have 3 months of living expenses set aside, why are you shopping? You should be sitting down at home, finding inexpensive ways to save money, i.e. feeding your mind, investing, spend $20, take you 30 days to work a book, not read it, but work it, actually write notes, dissect it, analyze it. In 30 days, you'd be surprised how much money you could set aside, but that's a whole nother topic. But the whole idea is, how can you be armed with this information about the Seminole Nation and the runaways from the institution of slavery, the Maroon Nation, aka American descendants of slavery? How can you be armed with this information and then turn around and justify celebrating a Holocaust? Because that's what Thanksgiving is. It's a European Holocaust on natives of this land. How do you celebrate that? Well, let's see. What else do we celebrate? We celebrate the chemical warfare culture, aka crack cocaine culture. We celebrate that through music. We celebrate a lot of our horrors. We celebrate our oppression. That's how full flight from reality we are as a group of people. We celebrate our oppression. I want to jump back to step 4. Ask all nonprofit organizations you attend, what's your position on reparations? If you've attended your nonprofit organization once, twice, 3 times, maybe 4 times last month, did you ask the question? Or are you scared of being unaccepted at that organization? See, if you're still concerned about what people think and how people are going to judge you when you know you're standing on principle and you know that if you're putting money in their collection plate, you have every right to ask the question, what's your stance on reparations? Because if you don't support the liberation of my people, why am I wasting time down here with you? That should be common sense, because every other group of people expect that from their institutions. Immigrants aren't coming over here putting money in these nonprofit organizations and allowing these nonprofit organizations to not work on their behalf. The Me Too movement, those European women aren't putting money into these organizations and then letting them do what they want to do with the money. No, there's an agenda for you to get my money. The gay agenda. You think these people are giving money to their institutions so they can do whatever they want to with the money. The only group of people that give money to institutions and nonprofit organizations and don't demand anything in return is niggas. That has to stop. Closing out the 400th year milestone, that has to stop. If they kick you out the organization, so what? You got your money in your pocket. God doesn't need money. Man does. God does not need money. Man does. Let me break it down a little further. Whatever organization that you are part of, when you put money in that basket, that money is collected. That money goes to a treasurer. The treasurer is going to count that money, and the next business day, he's going to deposit it in the bank. God ain't got nothing to do with that. We have to wake up and start playing the game to win. You're not going to Bank of America, Wells Fargo, SunTrust, any bank under the United States government and depositing my money, and you're not working for me. Those days are over. I don't want to hear about God. I'm talking to a man. God does not need money. Man does. So I'm closing this. As I close this one out, I said I want to make a special shout out for the remainder of the 8 weeks, of the 7 weeks. Shout out to Tone Talks. If you haven't heard of them, look them up on YouTube. You can go to ADOS101.com, go to the Black Agenda page, and get yourself up to breast. As you hear me talk about American descendants of slavery, you want to go to ADOS101.com, go to the Black Agenda page on that website, and get a clear understanding of where that language comes from and what the agenda is for our lineage group. Shout out to Yvette Carnell. You can check her out on YouTube as well. Shout out to Dr. Claude Anderson. You can check him out on YouTube on his Powernomics channel. He's going to give you the history and law from a military standpoint. And also, he's going to give you history and law from a military standpoint, from a European perspective, right? But you need that information because it's factual. Dr. William Katz, he is highly underrated. You want to YouTube him as well. He actually just YouTube Dr. William Katz, because you need a balance. I like to stand on the edge of a coin. I like to look at heads. I like to look at tails, and I stand on the edge. So if you're going to look at the head of a coin, you can listen to Dr. Claude Anderson. You want to look at the tail of a coin, listen to Dr. William Katz. He has a lot of books about us. And then you stand on the edge, and then you use your intuition or your fruition or your common sense, or intuitively you'll just start understanding things. Shout out to Dr. Umar Johnson. He's got the Frederick Douglass Marcus Garvey Academy. Of course, you can check Dr. Umar Johnson out on YouTube. Support him. Support his school. The brother has a school. It's paid for, debt free. That brother really needs our support to start helping the youth. Period. Point blank. End of discussion. Dr. Umar, man, salute to you, man. I mean, you did it. I mean, you hands down. Professor Black Truth, you can check him out on YouTube when you want to get a higher frequency of black media. Go to YouTube and check out Professor Black Truth. Black Authority, you can check him out as well on YouTube. Tariq Nasheed, he's widely known for Hidden Colors. You can check him out on YouTube as well. All of this is information, black media or black topics that we're not hearing on CNN, MSNBC, or any of your local news stations. We have to go underground to get our information. And last but not least, I'm going to say Dr. Barashango, who is the author of Afro-Americans and European Holidays of Mental Genocide. You can check him out on YouTube as well. And you can check out his videos. And the 3 books that I'm going to recommend in closing, again, is going to be African American People and European Holidays, A Mental Genocide. The Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask by Dr. Claude Anderson. Of course, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, The Miseducation of the Negro. And then I'm also going to recommend Black Indians by Dr. William Katz. And so those are 4 books that will get you grounded. And yeah, and then you'll be off and running from there. So stay tuned for next week, week 7. Let's stay consistent with redirecting our money. Let's stay away from these European holidays because we don't realize how much power we have. If we do not celebrate these last 2 holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas, you talk about getting the United States government's attention politically, let us find something else to do with our money. And we will get their attention very, very quickly because the United States government is broke. There is no money. We just have to grow into that understanding. And eventually we'll get to a point where just like we got permits back in Atlanta and back in the day and had Freaknik started and Daytona Spring Break and Lauderdale and Fort Lauderdale, Florida. What's stopping us from getting a permit and going to a park or having some type of function or some type of parade, and we have our own holiday and we can pick any one of our Black inventors or any one of our American heroes and just make it an American Black holiday? We can do that. It's just a matter of us just stopping and just think we're good for partying. We're good for the general. We knew how to set up a Freaknik and shut a city down. Why don't we just create our own holiday? That's a little bit further down the road, but at least we can stop celebrating European holidays. But the next step is once we stop celebrating their holidays, we can pick from any of these Black inventors or any of our American Black heroes, and we can just go down, purchase a permit in any city under the United States government, get organized, and just say, hey, this day right here is Marcus Garvey Day, or this day is Dr. Claude Anderson Day, or this day is Dr. Carter G. Woodson's Day, who, by the way, established Black History Week. So if it is somebody who we need to have a holiday for within our own group, I think Dr. Carter G. Woodson should be the first one, because you wouldn't have a Black History Month if it wasn't for Dr. Carter G. Woodson. But you won't find that out until you buy the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. We are the gods.